So far in political geography, we've talked about the different types of states that exist and connections to power within different ethnic groups and nationalities in context of the idea of devolution and autonomous regions. So now we're switching over to section 8.3, which is looking at boundary shapes and problems that causes. We've already kind of looked at this a little bit with the ethnicity unit when we talked about irredentism, when we mentioned things like shadow belt regions, balkanization, and also just the whole creation of the African continent via the Berlin Conference resulting from that, and then the creation of the African states that we see today, and how that has led to certain ethnic conflicts resulting from that. So this is more particular on other types of boundaries and considering on the lasting impacts that those could have and the reasons for why those boundaries are what they are. Okay, so just kind of a quick definition here of the idea between a boundary and a frontier. So a frontier is a zone where no one state exercises complete political control. So when we hear, like the final frontier or the western frontier, those areas that really no one group had sovereign power over. Now, as countries and power and groups have expanded over time, we've gone from having more frontiers and fewer boundaries to the opposite. All right, because now, again, as more countries have dominated different parts of the planet, we have more boundaries and fewer frontiers. So the certain examples that still exist about where are the frontiers, international waters, space, Antarctica typically fit into that. So our definition of a boundary is typically an invisible line that marks the extent of a state's territory. I say mostly because obviously some state borders, obviously you can see that with, walls, you can see that with, roads, barriers, things like that establish it. But essentially, it's like a line on the map that would just say, here's the extent of Minnesota versus Wisconsin, Minnesota versus Iowa, Dakotas, but also, United States and Canada, All right. And so there's a number of different types of boundaries that we're going to be looking at throughout this video. So one type is a cultural boundary, okay? And this follows the distribution of cultural characteristics. So when we talk about a cultural boundary, think about, the different ethnic boundaries that separate ethnic states or nation states from one another. So when you think about, Germany from Denmark or France from Spain, some of that might follow some geographic parts, but that also really follows along, again, nationality and ethnic lines than it does anything else. All right. And so you can figure that out with a lot of other countries as well, as particularly like between, that really follows just kind of the examples I had, but also within, Israel, Palestine also fits in with that as well. And we'll look at other examples and other types as we go through, playing with the idea of other types of boundaries at the same time. So we also have geometric boundaries. Okay, these are typically more straight lines drawn on a map, often arbitrary and done by ruling powers. Think again how Africa was divided up and how in some cases it's very geometric. Also think about how many of our states are shaped here in the US, but also the boundary between Washington State and British Columbia is very much of that nature. Then we also get, in terms of the cultural boundary, okay, connects itself back to ethnic boundaries. So boundaries that coincide with differences in ethnicity, think about, again, language and religion that we've mentioned many times now. Okay, Ireland and Northern Ireland, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh fit more ethnic boundaries than they do actual geometric ones. We've drawn the geometric things around. They're not necessarily straight lines, but we've created the boundaries around those different ethnic groups. So again, here is more of a, geometric boundary within, here's British Columbia and the way that it's drawn right there at the parallel, okay, between the United States and Canada, right along that part with Washington State. And then again, we also look, here within the different countries of the northern half of Africa within there. So then we also talk about the cultural boundaries. So an example here, Cyprus, which we've, alluded to in previous units about differences within Cyprus. So Cyprus is majority Greek, but the location of the island is closer to Turkey. So here's Greece, here's Turkey, here's the island of Cyprus. So here's the Greek area, here's the Turkish area. The nationalities have battled over who should have control, all right? And so the UN keeps it essentially as a buffer zone with a UN buffer zone as a wall that essentially keeps the two areas separate to pretty much prevent violence. And the British having formal control over Cyprus have also maintained military bases there to do that. And so they decide, do we want to be one country of Cyprus or do we want to be two countries or do we want to even try for unification with, Turkey or within Greece? So that comes in with that too. Okay, so because Turkey also has played a role about do they want to conquer the place or integrate it into their own. So going back to the idea of, oh, that shouldn't be there actually. We'll come back to our map that we've talked about with the Berlin Conference before. Then we also get physical, also known as antecedent boundaries, and these are ones that coincide with significant features of the natural landscape. So when we think about what are the borders of Minnesota with our, neighbors, whether that is with a foreign country or within the other, states, for the most part, they fit physical boundaries, but also geometric. So when we talk about Minnesota and Wisconsin, it follows predominantly along the St. Croix and Mississippi rivers that are essentially our boundary with Wisconsin. Okay, with North Dakota, it follows the Red River as it leads into the Minnesota River, and also a little bit within South Dakota, and then it fits into the rest of South Dakota, and Iowa is geometric. Canada predominantly follows along, the Great Lakes, follows along, the Boundary Waters, Lake of the Woods, and then a little bit with Manitoba as a, province of Canada, again, back to the geometric. Again, within the idea of physical antecedent, Spain and France, that's that cultural boundary, again, due to the physical differences. So antecedent being another word in this case for physical boundary. Then we get superimposed. That's where this map of Africa was supposed to be. So a superimposed is one that is forcibly drawn that cuts a unified cultural boundary between different peoples. Excuse me. So when we talk about this, so again, Africa as a whole with all these arbitrary lines by European colonialism is a great example of a superimposed boundary. All right. I don't know why I have Israel-Palestine here. That shouldn't be there. I mean, it's superimposed on the Israelis and the Palestinians, but wasn't a unified boundary. Well, actually, you could even say it was a unified boundary with all the Palestinians in that territory, and then obviously split up for Jewish people. But other examples, New Guinea and the Indonesian part of New Guinea that is controlled by them versus the other half of the island is controlled by Papua New Guinea in the eastern part. So I wish I had a map of that. Then we also get a type of relic boundary that no longer serves its purpose because the boundary no longer exists, but you can still see it in the landscape. So this is, I tried finding images of this. The book mentions it, and so do other sources, between Vietnam and South Vietnam, or in Vietnam, during the Vietnam War, you had a distinction between North Vietnam and South Vietnam. There was a very obvious border between the two. Vietnam has been united now for 45 plus-ish years. And I couldn't find anything other than like a landmark kind of observing that, but I couldn't find anything, any images to support the relic boundary, so I'll just kind of go with it. But definitely between East and West Germany, what existed, and East and West Berlin specifically. So the Berlin Wall fits within that idea. So back in the Cold War, following World War II, to keep Germany from becoming a power again in terms of punishment, they split the country in two. You had the democratic West that was controlled by the French, British, and Americans, and then the East Germans controlled by the Soviet Union. And then East and West Berlin, being the capital city, was also split into 4 sections again. But West Berlin was kind of like an outlier of democracy. And knowing that the East Germans were going to remain communist under the Soviet control essentially as a puppet state, but West Germany became its own independent country once they brought in the American, French, and British zones into one country. You had a lot of people in East Germany trying to get to the West. And so Russia set up very big boundaries, obviously along here, that made it very difficult to get over to the western side. But they also did that here because if they escaped to West Berlin, they were in West Germany and were free of their grasp. So they put an entire barrier around the city. I don't even know how many square miles that would be, around the western half that separated not just West and East Berlin, but West Berlin from the rest of East Germany, so that East Germans couldn't just escape to the West that way, as many had done. So you have the actual construction being shown here. If we're back in regular school next year and you ever seen the movie, what did we watch? Bridge of Spies in U.S. history. That does a great job showing kind of that, and people died trying to escape over to the western side from the east. Then you have the actual fall of the Berlin Wall here in 1989. and then the actual destruction. And some remnants are still there. So you can find some remnants of the wall still there. A lot of people destroyed it, took it as souvenirs. But there are still parts of it that are there for historical purposes. Okay. And then this connects itself to another boundary when we talk about the ocean, the law of the sea. Who governs it and how? Where does jurisdiction end? Consider, we have Great Lakes, but we share that with Canada. How much of that is U.S. territory? How do we define that? So the law of the sea is essentially governed by or determined for each of these countries to follow these same laws that everyone has to abide by. So it sets the standard of who owns and controls the seas or areas of the sea. And so I would just kind of familiarize yourself with this. You usually see one question a year on the AP exam with this. And then you'll see, typically one question on like a unit test or 2 questions or something like that, typically on this in terms of multiple choice. But you could also see it coming up in a political FRQ about boundaries and things like that. So it's something to be aware of. So to explain that, okay, yet your first territorial waters, this is the first 12 nautical miles, which is 14 land miles. How they compare the two, I'm not 100% sure, beyond the shore, and the state sets laws on who can kind of come in and out of that. So essentially, when you're 12 miles away, nautical miles away, a state can dictate who comes in and out. Okay. In the contiguous zone, states can enforce laws on immigration, pollution, taxes, and customs 12 more miles beyond that. So not necessarily, visitors, but, or just people kind of in the waters, but they can control, okay, are people dumping stuff there? Can they tax people's businesses out in this area? If they're conducting business or gambling, fishing, all that is still within their power 24 miles within the border. And then you have the exclusive economic zone. So this is the right to use and exploit natural resources 200 miles from the shoreline, so much further away. And this is where you get into things within fishing, within oil, and really I'm struggling to think of anything else that goes with that at this point. But those are, again, within the idea of the law of the sea within that. So this is kind of, again, the exact example here. So territorial, very short. Okay, that's just kind of conducting who can come into the shoreline. Contiguous zone, taxes, pollution, immigration, fishing, and oil drilling and stuff like that into the ocean. And then everything else is essentially internationally controlled or through international agreements. All right, so that's the different types of shape boundaries, or not shape boundaries. That's the thing that we've already talked about. That is the different types of borders and the reasons that those exist. And obviously, you can think about how that can create conflict or where that conflict could come from, but how it's meant to essentially avoid conflict through that means. But again, when we look at physical antecedent boundaries, we know that some of them fit really neatly along physical boundaries. Others don't. Okay, that's where you have your geometric ones. You also have things that are essentially imposed to keep, certain political groups or peoples in power, or to separate ethnicities, or for natural resources, as we've seen within Africa and other parts of the globe. So that's where we're going to finish up here, and then start focusing on the final section, 8.4, when we now begin to focus on the types of government and government organization.